the main part of my talk is structured as follows. So I will first focus on some basics on system identification, which basically means that I want to learn dynamical systems based on observational data. And I want to do that using artificial neural nets. And then in the second step, I want to connect these types of approaches to control dynamical systems. And then I will also show you a few applications. One application is related to inventory management or supply chain management. And the second application is a biomedical one. So let's start with the dynamical systems learning part. So let's say you're given a dynamical system of the following form. You have a system state X that changes with time according to that vector field F. And our vector field could be explicitly time dependent, could be depending on the system state. But what we now want to do is we want to learn the vector field of our dynamical system using some general function approximator with parameters theta. And this general function approximator could be a neural network, right? And the example that I want to focus on is the spiral. It's a classic example in the learning literature. So you're given a bunch of observational data, these red points that are taken from the underlying true trajectory. And now we want to learn the underlying dynamical system. How can we do that? So we could use a neural network and leverage its universal approximation capabilities. And universal approximation basically means that you can use a neural network that is sufficiently deep and sufficiently wide to learn a well-behaved function. And one of the papers that established these universal approximation capabilities was published in the early 90s by Kurt Hornig, who still works in Austria. It's one of the like really fundamental contributions in machine learning. And so now we basically know that we can use a neural network that is sufficiently wide and sufficiently deep to learn a dynamical system. And the dynamical system that I want to learn is a very simple one. It's this one. It has, right, it's just a linear system with 4 parameters. But I just don't want to learn these 4 parameters. I just want to basically use this dynamical system to generate observational data, these red dots. And now I want to learn the dynamical system using a neural network. And our neural network uses as input X and Y. That's the input layer. It has a number of hidden layers with activation functions, that may differ depending on the application you consider. And as an output, we get X dot and Y dot. So X dot and Y dot is simply the rate of change, right? We input the system state and we get as a return the rate of change of our system state. Now, if you now use this neural network and you integrate it in time, so you basically consider it as a function and you integrate it in time, and you use a very simple integration scheme, for example, Euler's method, then you would take your neural network F, which takes as an input the system state, you multiply it with a small time step, you add the system state, the current system state on top, and you get as an output the system state at a subsequent time step. And that's how you can visualize that. You have your neural network, you input a state, you multiply the output with a small time step, and that's how you integrate your dynamical system. Right? So we need to integrate our dynamical system in order to describe the evolution of our dynamical system and eventually learn the underlying dynamics that are associated with a given set of observational data. You can also make this a bit more complicated, and you could use another integration method, for example, a Runge-Kutta 4 integration method, and then you get these types of computational graphs in your underlying software that you use to implement these neural networks. And that's what the learning curves look like, or the learning progress looks like. You basically start right with your given ground truth, your given dynamical system, and the corresponding observational data. You train your neural network, or which we in this case call the neural ordinary differential equation, And after a few training epochs, you get this blue line. You train it further, you see that the approximation gets better. And eventually, after a couple of thousand training epochs, you're really able to learn the dynamical system relatively accurately for this given initial condition, right? I'm not talking about generalization now, but you see that for this given initial condition, you're able to approximate this dynamical system relatively well. And I'm telling you all of these points. It's more like a little tutorial to show you later on that these approaches can be used to learn relatively complex control functions. Because right now we're just approximating a given dynamical system, which is something that could be also done with other methods. So a historical note, these methods were already introduced in the 90s under the name Runge-Kutta neural networks. And this paper received between 100 and 200 citations in the past 2 to 3 decades. And then in 2018, another paper appeared in the NeurIPS conference proceedings, which was called Neural Ordinary Differential Equations. And what's interesting is that the authors cite the contributions from Runge and Kutta, but not the Runge-Kutta neural network paper. And this one now has a couple of thousand citations. You can look it up. It's really, it has so many applications. But this one got kind of not acknowledged in the conference paper. So why are these methods useful? In principle, they're useful to approximate dynamical systems that might be hard to model using mechanistic approaches. So for certain dynamical systems, you may not be able to write down mechanistic evolution equations because you don't have a good physical or biological understanding of the underlying dynamics, right? There are systems that could be described by coupled pendula. This is a picture taken from the physics department at ETH. They really built a large coupled pendula experiment. So for these systems, it might be able to write down the evolution equations, but for other systems, it might be very hard to do that. And that's, for example, the case for high-dimensional so-called birth-death immigration processes. So these are processes where at the population level, you have animal species competing for food sources, migrating to different parts in a given area. And similar processes also occur in our body. So the human microbiome is another high-dimensional dynamical system for which it is actually quite difficult to formulate exact evolution equations because there are just too many species interacting. So for these systems, it's actually kind of useful to have a general approximation method to approximate a dynamical system given observational data. And similarly for our adaptive immune system, which is also extremely high dimensional. So our immune system has parts in it like receptors on our B and T cells that can have a richness, so the number of unique occurrences of certain receptors that are like a couple of billion or even billions. So these systems can be really high dimensional, and again, it might be very difficult to write down evolution equations. So now, how can we make a connection to control? Because right now, I just told you something about learning a dynamical system, but not controlling a dynamical system. So the control part is quite interesting too. So a standard definition of controllability, or a very basic definition, would be given a dynamical system that you want to steer from an initial state x0 to a target state in finite time t, you want to minimize such a functional. So you have some term that accounts for an integrated cost, right? That could be the energy you spend over a certain time, and you have a final cost. And your constraint is given by a dynamical system that depends on both the system state and the control input u. So u is a control function. And there are now different approaches to solve these kinds of dynamical system or constrained dynamical systems problems. And one approach is based on Pontryagin's maximum principle, And another approach is based on the solution of the so-called Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equations. And like without discussing advantages and disadvantages of these methods in great detail, so what's basically an issue with both of these approaches is that it's relatively difficult to apply them to high-dimensional and potentially stochastic dynamical systems. So if we, for example, think about complex supply chain networks, it's relatively difficult to apply them. They're easy to apply to, like these standard textbook examples, like lunar landers that are supposed to land in a given area, consuming like an optimal amount of fuel. And these approaches, of course, also have applications in the real world. And another famous textbook example is stabilizing a cart pole. So these are also systems that you can solve easily on a sheet of paper. But there are also other more complex problems where you really need some more advanced control methods, like these types of problems where you want to train these robot actuators. And modern approaches use so-called reinforcement learning methods. So this one here is based on a model-free reinforcement learning method. So now I spent a couple of minutes in the beginning of my presentation on telling you about parametrizing a dynamical system using a neural network. What we could also do instead of parametrizing the dynamical system using a neural network is to parameterize the control function itself using a neural network. And again, like the idea is not to, replace standard control theory or to control the world, as Dirk mentioned yesterday. But the idea is really just for certain control problems, it's difficult to parameterize these functions. And neural networks can be very useful to parameterize them and to solve complex control problems. And then similarly to the iterative procedure that I showed you that we use to learn a dynamical system, we can also use the same idea to learn the optimal control solution associated with a given control problem. And to show you an example, I again took a very simple dynamical system that is linear. And the optimal solution for this control problem is, so we basically want to start at this point, x naught, and go to the target state, x star. But the optimal solution is not to go from this point to that point on that straight line connecting these 2 points, because this is kind of swimming against the vector field, right? The flow of the underlying dynamical system, the flow points upwards. So it's better to move around that circle or that half circle. And that's also what the neural network learns. So that's an animation of the learning process. Again, like this problem can be solved analytically relatively easily, but it's a nice little toy problem to show the learning process of a neural ODE type controller. And what you see here is the evolution of control energy, so the energy that you need to input into the system to steer it to the target state. Right. And since we are talking about urbanization, I also wanted to add a little application to a topic which I think is relevant to urban system science, and that's inventory management. But one can also apply similar ideas to bigger supply chain networks. And so one project that we focused on addressed the following question. So you're given 2 suppliers, a slow one that is relatively cheap and a faster one that is more expensive. And you could imagine that you manage some like car manufacturer, and you need to order goods, maybe even or supplies either from maybe Mexico or China. The Mexican supplies might be a bit more expensive but faster, and the ones from China might be a bit slower but cheaper. And this problem has been formulated more than 60 years ago, but there's still no complete solution. There's no complete solution available to this problem. And what you basically need to do is you need to keep track of your net inventory, right? It evolves as follows. You take the current net inventory, you add the two orders on top of your inventory, and then you subtract the demand. Yeah. And what we want to do is we want to optimize or minimize the overall cost. And that's something that we can do either using some of these existing heuristics that have been developed over the past 60 years, and they still have relatively large optimality gaps. Or what we can also do is we can use a neural network learning approach to parameterize and learn the underlying control function. And that's what the learning progress looks like. So you get, after 5 minutes of training on this laptop, a control solution with an optimality gap that is smaller than that of the best available heuristic. And that's what the output looks like, right? You have more flexibility in the regular orders, and you place fewer expedited orders. So this is something that I will jump over. If you want to try it out, you can install this package. And what we are currently doing is we are currently also working together with different companies that share with us their distribution center and supermarket data. We are not thinking right now about employing these neural network optimization methods, but maybe that's one of the next steps, because we know of several bigger companies that use these methods because they provide a bit more flexibility. And yeah, I will stop here and look forward to your questions. And thanks a lot for your attention.